Hi, my friends, it's Kate. We're back for the final installment of James and the Giant Peach. So exciting. So, last you remember, the centipede had a giant pot of purple paint poured on him by the cloud men who were very angry because they broke the rainbow. So, shall we continue? Chapter 29. It seemed like a long time before the seagulls were able to pull the peach away from the horrible rainbow cloud, but they managed it at last, and then everybody gathered around the wretched centipede and began arguing about the best way to get the paint off his body. He really did look a sight. He was purple all over, and now that the paint was beginning to dry and harden, he was forced to sit stiff, very upright, as though he were encased in cement. And all 42 of his legs were sticking straight out in front of him like rods. He tried to say something, but his lips wouldn't move. All he could do now was to make gurgling noises in his throat. The old green grasshopper reached out and touched him carefully on the stomach. But how could it possibly have dried so quickly? He asked. It's rainbow paint, James answered. Rainbow paint dries very quick and very hard. I detest paint, Miss Spider announced. It frightens me. It reminds me of Aunt Spiker, the late Aunt Spiker, I mean, because the last time she painted her kitchen ceiling, my poor darling grandmother stepped into it by mistake when it was still wet, and there she stuck. And all through the night we could hear her calling to us, saying, "Help, help," and it was heartbreaking to listen to her. But what could we do? Not a thing until the next day when the paint had dried, and then, of course, we all rushed over to her and calmed her down and gave her some food. Believe it or not, she lived for 6 months like that, upside down on the ceiling with her legs stuck permanently in the paint. She really did. We fed her every day. We brought her fresh flies straight from the web. But then, on the 26th of April last, Aunt Sponge, the late Aunt Sponge, I mean, happened to glance up at the ceiling, and she spotted her. "A spider!" she cried. "A disgusting spider! Quick, fetch me the mop with the long handle." And then, oh, it was awful. I can't bear to think of it. The spider wiped away a tear and looked sadly at the centipede. "You poor thing," she murmured. "I do feel sorry for you." "It'll never come off," the earthworm said brightly. "Our centipede will never move again. He will turn into a statue, and we shall be able to put him in the middle of the lawn with a bird bath on top of his head." "We could try peeling him like a banana," the old green grasshopper suggested. "Or rubbing him with sandpaper," the ladybug said. "Now, if he stuck out his tongue," the earthworm said, smiling a little for perhaps the first time in his life, "if he stuck out his tongue really far, then we could all catch hold of it and start pulling. And then if we pulled hard enough, we could turn him inside out, and he would have a new skin." There was a pause while the others considered this proposal. "I think," James said, "I think that the best thing to do—" Then he stopped. "What was that?" he asked quickly. "I heard a voice. I heard someone shouting." Chapter 30. They all raised their heads, listening. "Shh! There it is again." But the voice was too far away from them to hear what it was saying. "It's the cloudmen!" Miss Spider cried. "I just know it. It's the cloudmen. They're after us again." "It came from above," the earthworm said. Automatically, everybody looked upward, except the centipede, who couldn't move. "Ouch," they said. "Help! Mercy! We're going to catch it this time." For what they now saw swirling and twisting directly over their heads was an immense, dark, black cloud. a terrible, dangerous, thundery-looking thing that began to rumble and roar even as they were staring at it. And then, from high up on top of the cloud, the faraway voice came down to them once again, this time very loud and clear. "On with the faucets!" it shouted. "On with the faucets! On with the faucets!" 3 seconds later, the hole underneath of the cloud seemed to split and burst open like a paper bag, and then out came the water. They saw it coming. It was quite easy to see because it wasn't just raindrops. It wasn't raindrops at all. It was a great solid mass of water that might have been a lake or a whole ocean dropping out of the sky on top of them. And down it came, down, 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 crashing first onto the seagulls and then onto the peach itself, while the poor travelers shrieked with fear and groped around frantically for something to catch a hold of. The peach string, the silk strings, anything they could find. And all the time the water came pouring and roaring down upon them, bouncing and smashing and sloshing and swashing and swirling and surging and whirling and gurgling and gushing and rushing and rushing. It was like being pinned underneath the biggest waterfall in the world and not being able to get out. They couldn't speak. They couldn't see. They couldn't breathe. And James Harry Trotter, holding on madly to one of the silk strings above the peach stem, told himself that this must surely be the end of everything at last. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the deluge stopped. They were out of it, and it was all over. The wonderful seagulls had flown right through it and had come out safely on the other side. Once again, the giant peach was sailing peacefully through the mysterious moonlit sky. "I'm drowned," gasped the old green grasshopper, spitting water out by the pint. "It's gone right through my skin," the earthworm groaned. "I always thought my skin was waterproof, but it isn't, and now I'm full of rain." "Look at me! Look at me!" shouted the centipede excitedly. "It washed me clean. The paint's all gone. I can move again." "That's the worst news I've had in a long time," the earthworm said. The centipede was dancing around the deck and turning somersaults in the air and singing at the top of his voice. "Oh, hooray for the storm and the rain. I can move, I don't feel any pain. And now I'm a pest, and I'm the biggest and the best, the most marvelous pest once again." "Oh, do shut up," the green grasshopper said. "Look at me!" cried the centipede. "Look at me, I am freed, I am freed. Not a scratch, not a bruise, nor a bleed. To his grave this fine gent they all thought they had sent, and I very near went. Oh, I very near went. But they can't quite scent the wrong centipede." Chapter 31. "How fast we are going all of a sudden," the ladybug said. "I wonder why." "I don't think the seagulls like this place any better than we do," James said. "I imagine they want to get out of it as soon as they can. They got a bad fright in that storm we've just been through." Faster and faster flew the seagulls, skimming across the sky at a tremendous pace, with the peach trailing out behind them. Cloud after cloud went by on either side, all of them ghostly white in the moonlight. And several more times during the night, the travelers caught glimpses of the cloud men moving around the tops of these clouds, working their sinister magic upon the world below. Once they passed a snow machine in operation, with the cloud men turning the handle and a blizzard of snowflakes blowing out of the great funnel above. They saw huge drums that were for making thunder, and the cloudmen beating them furiously with long hammers. They saw the frost factories and the wind producers and the places where cyclones and tornadoes were manufactured and sent spinning down to the earth. And once, deep in the hollow of a large billowy cloud, they spotted something that could only have been a cloudmen's city. There were caves everywhere running into the cloud, and at the entrances to the caves, the cloudmen's wives were crouching over little stoves with frying pans in their hands, frying snowballs for their husbands' suppers. And hundreds of cloudmen children were frisking about all over the place and shrieking with laughter and sliding down billows of the clouds on toboggans. An hour later, just before dawn, the travelers heard a soft whooshing sound above their heads, and they glanced up and saw an immense, gray, bat-like creature swooping down towards them out of the dark. It circled round and round the peach, its great wings flapping its great wings slowly in the moonlight and staring at the travelers. Then it uttered a series of long, deep, melancholy cries and flew off again into the night. "Oh, I do wish the morning would come," the spider said, shivering all over. "It won't be long now," James answered. "Look, it's getting lighter out there already." They all sat in silence, watching the sun as it came up slowly over the rim of the horizon for a new day. Chapter 32. And when full daylight came at last, they all got to their feet and stretched their poor cramped bodies, and then the centipede, who always seems to see things first, shouted, "Look, there's land below!" "He's right," they cried, running to the edge of the peach and peering over. "Hooray! Hooray!" It looks like streets and houses, but how enormous it all is! A vast city glistening in the early morning sunshine lay spread out 3,000 feet below them. At that height, the cars were like little beetles crawling along the streets, and people walking on the pavement looked no larger than tiny grains of soot. "But what tremendously tall buildings!" exclaimed the ladybug. "I've never seen anything like them before in England. Which town do you think it is?" "This couldn't possibly be England," said the old green grasshopper. "Then where is it?" asked Miss Spider. "You know what those buildings are?" shouted James, jumping up and down with excitement. "Those are skyscrapers. This must be America. And that, my friends, means that we have crossed the Atlantic Ocean overnight." "You don't mean it," they cried. "It's not possible. It's incredible. It's unbelievable." "Oh, I've always dreamed of going to America," cried the centipede. "I had a friend once who—" "Be quiet," said the earthworm. "Who cares about your friend? The thing we've got to think about now is how on earth are we going to get down to the earth?" "Ask James," said the ladybug. Excuse me. "I don't think that should be very difficult," James told them. "All we have to do is cut loose a few seagulls. Not too many, mind you, but just enough so that the others can't quite keep us up in the air. Then down we shall go, slowly and gently, until we reach the ground. The centipede will bite through the strings for us, one at a time." Chapter 33. Far below them, in the city of New York, something like pandemonium was breaking out. A great ball as big as a house had been sighted, hovering high up in the sky over the very center of Manhattan. And the cry had gone up that it was an enormous bomb sent over by another country to blow the whole city to smithereens. Air raid sirens began wailing in every section. All radio stations and TV programs were interrupted with announcements that the population must go down into their cellars immediately. 1 million people walking in the streets on their way to work looked up into the sky and saw the monster hovering above them and started running for the nearest subway entrance to take cover. Generals grabbed hold of telephones and shouted orders to everyone they could think of. The mayor of New York called up the President of the United States down in Washington, D.C. to ask for help. And the president, who at the moment was having breakfast in his pajamas, quickly pushed away his half-finished plate of sugar crisps and started pressing buttons right and left to summon his admirals and his generals. And all the way across the vast stretch of America, in all 50 states, from Alaska to Florida, from Pennsylvania to Hawaii, the alarm was sounded and the word went out that the biggest bomb in the history of the world was hovering over New York City, and that any moment it might go off. Oh my. Chapter 34. "Come on, centipede, bite through the first string," ordered James. The centipede took one of the strings between his teeth and bit through it. And once again, but not with an angry cloudman dangling from the end of the string, this time a single seagull came away from the rest of the flock and went flying out on its own. "Bite another," James ordered. The centipede bit through another string. "Why aren't we sinking?" "We are sinking." "No, we're not sinking." "Don't forget, the peach is a lot lighter now than when we started out," James told them. "It lost an awful lot of juice with all those hailstones hitting it in the night. Cut away 2 more seagulls, centipede." "Ah, that's better. Here we go. Now we're really sinking." "Yes, this is perfect. Don't bite any more, centipede, or we'll sink too fast. Gently does it." Slowly, the great peach began losing height, and the building and the streets below began coming closer and closer. "Do you think we'll get our picture in the papers when we get down?" the ladybug asked. "My goodness, I've forgotten to polish my boots," the centipede said. "Everyone must help me polish my boots before we arrive." "Oh, for heaven's sakes," said the earthworm. "Can't you ever stop thinking about—" But he never finished his sentence, for suddenly, whoosh! And they all looked up and saw a huge 4-engined plane come shooting out of a nearby cloud and go whizzing past them, not more than 20 feet over their heads. This was actually the regular early morning passenger plane coming into New York from Chicago, and as it went by, it sliced right through every single one of the silken strings. And immediately the seagulls broke away, and the enormous peach, having nothing to hold it up into the air any longer, went tumbling down toward the earth like a lump of lead. "Help!" cried the centipede. "Save us!" cried Miss Spider. "We are lost!" cried the ladybug. "This is the end!" cried the old green grasshopper. "James! Do something, James! Quickly, do something!" I can't, cried James. I'm sorry. Goodbye. Shut your eyes, everyone. It won't be long now. Chapter 35. Round and upside down went the peach as it plummeted toward the earth, and they were all clinging desperately to the stem to save themselves from being flung into space. Faster and faster it fell, down and down and down, racing closer and closer to the houses and the street below, where it would surely smash into a million pieces when it hit. And all the way down Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue and all along the other streets in the city, people had not yet reached the underground shelters, looked up and saw it coming, and they stopped running and stood there staring in a sort of stupor at what they thought was the biggest bomb in all the world falling out of the sky onto their heads. A few women screamed. Others knelt down on their sidewalks and began praying aloud. Strong men turned to one another and said things like, "I guess this is it, Joe," and "Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye." And for the next 30 seconds, the whole city held its breath, waiting for the end to come. Chapter 36. "Goodbye, Ladybug," gasped James, clinging to the stem of the falling peach. "Goodbye, Centipede. Goodbye, everybody." There were only a few seconds to go now, and it looked as though they were going to fall right in among all the tallest buildings. James could see the skyscrapers rushing up to meet them, and at the most awful speed. And most of them had square, flat rooftops, but the very tallest of them all had a top that tapered into a large, sharp point, like an enormous silver needle sticking up into the sky. And it was precisely onto the top of this needle that the peach fell. There was a squelch. The needle went in deep, and suddenly there was a giant peach caught and spiked upon the very pinnacle of the Empire State Building. Chapter 37. Oh my goodness. It was really an amazing sight. And in 2 or 3 minutes, as soon as all the people below realized this now couldn't possibly be a bomb, they came pouring out of the shelters and the subways to gape at the marvel. The streets for half a mile around the building were jammed with men and women, and when the word spread that there were actually living things moving about the top of the great round ball, then everyone went wild with excitement. "It's a flying saucer," they shouted. "They are from outer space. They are men from Mars. Or maybe they came from the moon." And a man who had a pair of binoculars to his eyes said, "They look pretty peculiar to me, I tell you that." Police cars and fire engines came screaming in from all over the city and pulled up outside the Empire State Building. 200 firemen and 600 policemen swarmed into the building and went up to the elevators as high as they could go. Then they poured out onto the observation roof, which is the place where tourists stand, just at the bottom of the big spike. All the policemen were holding their guns at the ready, with their fingers on the triggers, and the firemen were clutching their hatchets. But from where they stood, almost directly underneath the peach, they couldn't actually see the travelers up on top. "Ahoy there!" shouted the police chief. "Come out and show yourselves!" Suddenly, the great brown head of the centipede appeared over the side of the peach. His black eyes, as large and round as 2 marbles, glared down at the policemen and the firemen below. Then his monstrously ugly face broke into a wide grin. The policemen and the firemen all started shouting at once. "Look! Look out!" they shouted. "It's a dragon!" "It's not a dragon, it's a wampus. It's a gorgon. It's a sea serpent. It's a proc. It's a miticore." 3 firemen and 5 policemen fainted and had to be carried away. "It's a schnozwanger," cried the chief of police. "It's a wang doodle," yelled the head of the fire department. The centipede kept on grinning. He seemed to be enjoying this enormously, all this commotion that he was causing. "Now see here," shouted the chief of police, cupping his hands to his mouth. "You listen to me. I want you to tell me exactly where you've come from." "We've come from thousands of miles away," the centipede shouted back, grinning more broadly than ever and showing his brown teeth. "There you are," cried the chief of police. "I told you they came from Mars." "I guess you're right," the head of the fire department said. At this point, the old green grasshopper poked his huge head over the side of the peach alongside the centipede. 6 more big, strong men fainted when they saw him. "That's an oink!" screamed the head of the fire department. "I just know it's an oink." "Or a cockatrice," yelled the chief of police. "Stand back, men. It may jump down on us at any moment." "What on earth are they talking about?" the old green grasshopper said to the centipede. "Search me," the centipede answered. "But they seem to be in an awful stew about something." Then Miss Spider's large, black, murderous-looking head, which to a stranger was probably the most terrifying of all, appeared next to the grasshopper. "Snakes and ladders!" yelled the head of the fire department. "We are finished now. It's a giant scorpula." "It's worse than that," cried the chief of police. "It's a venomous knid. Oh, just look at its vermicious, gruesome face." "Is that the kind that eats fully grown men for breakfast?" the head of the fire department asked, going white as a sheet. "I'm afraid it is," the chief of police answered. "Oh, please, why doesn't someone help us get down from here?" Miss Spider called out. "It's making me giddy." "This could be a trick," the head of the fire department said. "Don't anyone make a move until I say." "They've probably got space guns." "But we've got to do something," the head of the fire department announced grimly. "About 5 million people are standing below us, and they're watching." "Then why don't you put up a ladder?" the chief of police asked him. "I'll stand at the bottom and hold it steady for you while you go up and see what's happening." "Thanks very much," snapped the head of the fire department. Soon, there were no less than 7 fantastic faces peering down over the side of the peach. The centipedes, the old green grasshopper, Miss Spider, the earthworm, the ladybug, the silkworm, and the glowworm. And a sort of panic was beginning to break out among the firemen and the policemen on the rooftop. Then all at once, the panic stopped, and a great gasp of astonishment went up all around. For now a small boy was seen to be standing up there beside the other creatures. His hair was blowing in the wind, and he was laughing and waving and calling out, "Hello, everybody! Hello!" For a few minutes, the men below just stood there and stared and gaped. They simply couldn't believe their eyes. "Well, bless my soul!" cried the head of the fire department, going red in the face. "It really is a little boy, isn't it?" "Don't be frightened of us, please," James called out. We are so glad to be here." "What about the others beside you?" shouted the chief of police. "Are any of them dangerous?" "Of course they're not dangerous," James answered. "They're the nicest creatures in the world. Allow me to introduce them to you one by one, and then I'm sure you'll believe me. My friends, this is the centipede, and let me make it known. He is so sweet and gentle that, although he's overgrown, the Queen of Spain again and again has summoned him by phone to babysit and sing and knit and be a chaperone when nurse is off and all the real royal children are alone." "Small wonder," said a fireman, "they're no longer on the throne." "The earthworm, on the other hand," said James, beginning to expand, "is great for digging up the land and making old soils newer. Moreover, you should understand, he would be absolutely grand for digging subway tunnels and for making you a sewer." The earthworm blushed and beamed with pride. Miss Spider clapped and cheered and cried. Could any words be truer? "And the grasshopper, ladies and gents, is a boon in millions and millions of ways. You have only to ask him to give you a tune, and he plays, and he plays, and he plays. As a toy for your children, he's perfectly sweet. There's nothing so good in the shops. You've only to tickle the soles of his feet, and he hops, and he hops, and he hops." "He can't be very fierce," exclaimed the head of all the cops. "And now, without excuse, I'd like to introduce this charming glowworm, lover of simplicity. She is easy to install on your ceiling or your wall. And although this smacks a bit of eccentricity, it's really rather clever, for thereafter you will never, never, ever have the slightest need for electricity." At which no less than 52 policemen cried, "If this is true, that creature will get some fabulous publicity." And here we have Miss Spider, with a mile of thread inside her, who has personally requested me to say that she's never met Miss Muffet on her charming little tuffet. If she had, she would not have frightened her away. Should her looks sometimes alarm you, then I don't think it would harm you to repeat at least 100 times a day, I must never kill a spider. I must only help and guide her and invite her to the nursery to play." The police all nodded slightly, and the firemen smiled politely, and about a dozen people cried, "Hooray!" "And here's my darling ladybug, so beautiful and kind, my greatest comfort since this trip began. She has 400 children, and she's left them all behind, but they're coming on the next peach if they can." The cops cried, "She's entrancing." All the firemen started dancing, and the crowds all started cheering to a man. "And now the silkworm," James went on, "whose silk will bear comparison with all the greatest silks there are in Rome and Philadelphia. If you would search the whole world through, from Paraguay to Timbuktu, I don't think you would find one bit of silk that could compare with it. Even the shops in Singapore don't have the stuff, and what is more, this silkworm had, I'll have you know, the honor not so long ago to spin and weave and sew and press the Queen of England's wedding dress. And she's already made and sent a waistcoat for your president." "Well, good for her," the cops cried out, and all at once a mighty shout went up around the Empire State. Let's get them down at once. Why wait? Chapter 38. 5 minutes later, they were all safely down, and James was excitedly telling his story to a group of flabbergasted officials. And suddenly, everyone had come over on the Peach was a hero. They were all escorted to the steps of City Hall, where the mayor of New York made a speech of welcome. And while he was doing this, 100 steeplejacks, armed with the ropes and ladders and pulleys, swarmed up on top of the Empire State Building and lifted the giant Peach off the spike and lowered it to the ground. Then the mayor shouted, "We must now have a ticker-tape parade for our wonderful visitors." And so a procession was formed, and in the leading car, which was an enormous open limousine, sat James and all his friends. Next came the giant Peach itself. Men with cranes and hooks had quickly hoisted it onto a very large truck, and now there it sat, looking just as huge and proud and brave as ever. There was, of course, a bit of a hole in the bottom where the spike from the Empire State Building had gone in, but who cared about that? Or indeed about the peach juice that was dripping out of the Peach onto the street. Behind the Peach, skidding all over the place in the peach juice, came the mayor's limousine, and behind the mayor's limousine came about 20 other limousines carrying all the important people of the city. And the crowds went wild with excitement. They lined the streets and they leaned out of windows of the skyscrapers, cheering and yelling and screaming and clapping and throwing out bits of white paper and ticker tape. And James and his friends stood up in the car and waved back at them as they went by. Then, a rather curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along Fifth Avenue when suddenly a little girl in a red dress ran out from the crowd and shouted, "Oh, James, James, could I please have just a tiny taste of your marvelous peach?" "Help yourself," James shouted back. "Eat all you want. It won't keep forever." No sooner had he said this than about 50 other children exploded out of the crowd and came running onto the street. "Can we have some too?" they cried. "Of course you can," James answered. "Everyone can have some." The children jumped up onto the truck and swarmed like ants over the Peach, eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of what was happening spread quickly from street to street, more and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join the feast. Soon, there was a trail of children a mile long chasing after the Peach as it proceeded slowly up Fifth Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people, it looked as though the Pied Piper of Hamelin had suddenly descended upon New York. And to James, who had never dreamed that there could be so many children as this in the world, thought it was the most marvelous thing that had ever happened. By the time the procession was over, the whole gigantic fruit had been completely eaten up, and only the big brown stone in the middle, licked clean and shiny by 10,000 eager little tongues, was left standing on the truck. Chapter 39. And thus the journey ended, but the travelers lived on. Every one of them became rich and successful in the new country. The Centipede was made vice president in charge of sales of a high-class firm of boot and shoe manufacturers. The Earthworm, with his lovely pink skin, was employed by a company that made women's face creams to speak commercials on television. The Silkworm and the Spider, after they had both been taught to make nylon thread instead of silk, set up a factory together and made ropes for tightrope walkers. The Glowworm became the light inside the torch of the Statue of Liberty, and thus saved a grateful city from having to pay a huge electric bill every year. The old green grasshopper became a member of the New York Symphony Orchestra, where his playing was greatly admired. The ladybug, who had been haunted all her life by the fear that her house was on fire and her children all gone, married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. And as for the enormous peach stone, it was set up permanently in a place of honor in Central Park and became a famous monument. But it was not only a famous monument, it was also a famous house. And inside the house, there lived a famous person, James Henry Trotter himself. And all you had to do any day of the week was to go and knock upon the door, and the door would always be opened to you. And you would always be asked to come inside and see the famous room where James had first met his friends. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you would find the old green grasshopper in there as well, resting peacefully in a chair before the fire. Or perhaps it would be the ladybug who had dropped in for a cup of tea and a gossip. Or the centipede to show off a new batch of particularly elegant boots that he had just acquired. Every day of the week, hundreds and hundreds of children from far and near came pouring into the city to see the marvelous peach stone in the park. And James Henry Trotter, who once, if you remember, had been the saddest and loneliest boy that you could find, now had all the friends and playmates in the world. And because so many of them were always begging him to tell and tell again the story of his adventures on the peach, he thought it would be nice if one day he sat down and wrote it as a book. So he did. And that is what we have just finished reading. Thank you, everyone. Have a great time, and I'll see you next time.